In a very important way, it's a force for peace, nuclear weapons. But to get at what you're talking about, people in Europe, and of course people all over the world, live in fear of World War III because they believe it would be a nuclear war, which it probably would be. And the fact is that if you got into a major conflagration involving, let's say, the United States and China, or Russia and the United States, given that we don't know anything about we don't know much about escalation, we could all end up getting incinerated. There's no question about that. And it's the fact that we could all get incinerated, which is what makes nuclear weapons a force for peace. But nobody can guarantee that those nuclear weapons won't be used, and therefore there's a real dark side as well as a bright side to the presence of nuclear weapons in international politics. And it's always important to keep that in mind. Now, I was saying to you that I thought the most dangerous area is East Asia. And the best way to highlight that is to compare East Asia today with Europe in the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball on what we called the inter-German border, right? It was the central front. It was the center of Europe, which was the principal focal point between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet threat was seen as being mainly located in Europe. What you had in Europe were two massive armies, NATO armies, Warsaw Pact armies, armed to the teeth each with thousands of nuclear weapons, thousands of tactical aircraft. So when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was almost impossible to get a war started. This isn't a war game because everybody understood that when these two massive armies armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons crashed into each other, you would probably end up vaporizing everybody. So hard to get a war started. Fast forward to the present, to East Asia. There's no central front. Where are the flashpoints? South China Sea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea. Let's just talk about the South China Sea. It's very easy to imagine a war breaking out between the United States and China in the South China Sea. It's not the central front. Right? This is not to say, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying a war is likely to break out in the South China Sea, but it's much easier to imagine a war breaking out between the United States and China in the South China Sea, or over Taiwan, or in the East China Sea over those rocks that are disputed territory between China on one hand and Japan on the other. You can imagine a war breaking out quite easily. Again, that's not to say it's going to happen. Furthermore, when you start thinking about nuclear use, using nuclear weapons in the South China Sea, even using nuclear weapons in the context of defending Taiwan, is fundamentally different than using nuclear weapons on the Central Front during the Cold War. So what I'm saying to you is that if you think about the geography and the nature of the conflict in East Asia today and compare it to what we had in the Cold War, you see it's more dangerous. Then what you want to remember is that China is a potential regional hegemon. It is a peer competitor to the United States. And the United States cares about China much more than it cares about Russia. Russia is not a very powerful country. The reason that Germans are not spending lots of money on defense, and the reason that Germany is not mobilizing its population to contain Vladimir Putin, is because everybody knows deep down inside Russia's not a great threat, right? Despite all the hype you hear in Germany and in the West more generally, it's not a great threat. China is in a completely different category. From our point of view, China doesn't matter to you. You're a European. Given geography, China is no threat. If you're an American, China matters. It is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. It's the pacing threat. It's the one we really care about. It's why we should be pivoting to Asia. All of this is to say the potential for an intense security competition between the United States and China is not to be underestimated. And when you marry that to the fact that Taiwan is probably the central point of contention between the United States and China, and the Chinese to a person consider Taiwan sacred territory that we're keeping out of their hands, the potential for trouble is really great. And then marry that argument with what I said about using nuclear weapons or fighting wars out in the middle of the ocean versus fighting wars on the Central Front. So all of this is to say, if there is a place where there is potential for World War III with nuclear weapons, it's in East Asia. It's not in Europe.